Let's, in this very simple example, understand what's the difference between stateful and the stateless application. So for example, in this case, we have a stateful service which has a method visit. We can call it endpoint, and whenever user visits our website, then in that case, we are storing information about how many times user has visited our portal. So for example, in this case, if the user visits a portal, then in that case, what we do is we have created here hash map, and in the hash map, the keys being the username, and the value is that how many times user have visited our website. So for example, in this case, we are calling it 3 times, and the twice is that we user with the name Orkan, and the once user with the name Mike. If we run this, we can see that in our hash map, we are storing information about the user. Why this app, why this service, right? Why this app is called the Stateful. It's called Stateful because it stores state about the user. State about the user is basically data about the user that connects the request. So for example, let's say that there is a connection between the previous and the current request, right? So we are storing information. The only way that we can tell that how many times user has visited our website is that we can store that information. We can store that data on our side, on the server side, either in the database or in some storage. In our case, we are just simply storing that in the hash map. So if we are storing that state, if we can connect that user's previous and the current and the future request, that is called stateful application, in our case stateful service. Let's take another example. Let's say that we have a stateless service. In the stateless service, we don't store any information about the user, right? We don't store in the map, we don't store in the database. That's why in this case, this service is called the stateless applications, which means that we don't store any information about the user's state. So we don't store, there is no connection between the user's previous request or the future request and so on. So where we are using this case, right, stateful applications. Let's say that the user has visited an e-commerce website. In that case, when your user logs in, then we are tracking user activity by making the application stateful. So which means that there is a connection when the user, for example, logs in into the website, user visits reviews the products, and the user add those products into the cart in order to maintain the connection between all user activities in that website. So we need to use, our application needs to be stateful. So that is the main difference between the stateful and the stateless. Again, the stateful stores user's data and knows that has a connection between the request that the user sends, between user previous request, current and future, and the stateless application does not store that data. That's the only difference. Now let's go see that in real world application where we use it. So in real world application, we use it, for example, for authentication, right? For authentication, let's take a look at the stateful application. For the stateful application, the perfect example for that would be using a session cookies that is used in majority of the websites today. So what's the session cookie? Session cookie is, let's go take an example and review it one by one, right? So the first one is that when the user logs in with the username and the password, so what happens on the server side? Server verifies the credentials, and after that it generates the random session ID, and that session ID along with the user data and the user data such as user ID and the others, it's stored either in the server or it's stored in the cache databases such as Redis or Memcache and similar. After that, what the server does is it sends that session ID as a cookie to user. So whenever for each subsequent request, right? For each subsequent request, client need to, in our case, let's say browser, right? So we are using a browser, or let's say any client, for any subsequent request, browser or client should send that cookie to the server. That's how we are maintaining connection between the previous request, current, and the future requests that is coming from that client or from that browser. So that application is stateful. So when the server receives that request, session ID, it looks in the database and verifies that, okay, this session ID is generated by that server, and it provides access to that it gives access to that request. It authenticates that request basically. So why this app is called the Stateful? As we have talked about that earlier, the reason why it's called earlier, because it saves the information about the user. It remembers users' actions, right? If you delete a database, let's say that if you're using a database, Redis or Memcache, if you delete the database, all users' data instantly, all the session IDs are instantly gone and the user are logged out. So that's the example of the stateful application. And now let's review the stateless application, right? What's the stateless application? Stateless application is the more modern approach, is used by APIs, and it's used by the single page applications and so on. So what happens in the stateless application? Stateless application, when the user logs in, server again verifies the credentials, and after that, instead of generating a session ID, instead of generating a cookie, what it does is it creates a JWT token. JWT token contains all the information about the user, about the role, about the expiration time, and so on. And it signs that certificate and send that to user. User, usually client, right? Let's say client, or either browser or some other client, they usually store that in their local storage. And for every consequent request, users send that JWT token as a part of the request. Usually it's sent in the header as an authorization peer token, and we are sending a JWT token. So user, what the server does is, after receiving that JWT token, server validates that token by using a private key. So it decrypts that token and verifies that it indeed was issued by the server. So, and in this case, the server does not store any information about the authentication state, right? It just creates a JWT token, signs that token, and sends that to a user. It doesn't store any information about the user in the database or elsewhere. So that's the difference between the stateless and the stateful. So in this case, in case of the JWT token, when the server receives a request in the header which contains the JWT token, it doesn't have to have any information about the user stored in the database. It just need to decrypt that JWT token to verify that it's indeed issued by that server, and the JWT token contains all the information about the user ID, and the role, expiration time, and so on. So that is the difference between them. But let's now take a look at the more granular level. What are the exact difference, for example, in terms of the storage, right? If we compare the stateful, and for the stateful we can say that it's a main usage of it is the session cookies, and the stateless main usage is the JWT token. Then in that case, for the server stores, right? In case of the stateful, a session, we are storing a session record in a database. In case of the stateless application, we don't store anything, right? So we need to just verify that using a secret key, or using a secret key in our case, we need to verify that the JWT token is generated by the server. So the next one is what the client holds. In this case, the client holds the session ID, which is it stores that in the cookie. And in case of the JWT token, a client holds the JWT token that it sends with every request. The next one is that the validation, how the server validates our request. In case of the stateful application, it looks up in the database for the session ID. Again, if the database is gone, then in that case, all the users are instantly logged out. But in case of the stateless applications, what happened is we need to check that the token by decrypting it. So for the scalability for the stateful applications, it's harder to scale, because they are we need to store the information about the session for all servers, right? Or we need to use something called the sticky sessions. What sticky session is, that let's say that we are not using any cache database such as Redis or Memcache. We are storing information about the user only. Let's say we have 3 servers, right? and we are storing information about that user not in the database but in that server. In that case, what happens is, let's say, instead of sending a request to a server B to a server A, which generated that session ID, which generated that cookie, server B will not know any information about the server B, right? And the request will be rejected. So to avoid that case, we need to use something like distributed cache, Redis, or similar. So for the stateless, it's easier. For what we need to do is every server can validate that. Every server that has a private key can validate that request. So for logging out, it's easy for the stateful. We need to just delete the session ID from the database. But for the stateless, that's actually one of the disadvantages of the stateless applications. It's hard because it requires the token blacklisting, which in itself adds a state. So what's the primary use case for the stateful primary use case? The shopping cart, user authentication, and the WebSockets for chat. And for the stateless, it's usually APIs, for example, weather API, search API, public data feeds, and so on. Let's take this example. For example, in this case, I've started locally an application, Spring application, where we have one endpoint, hotels, which returns us the list of the hotels. So how to see that whether or not this website is sending us the cookies? So for that, for example, in case of I'm using here Chrome. So in case of the Chrome, so what we need to do is we can go to the applications, and here we can see that all the information that is sent to us. So we can session storage about the IndexedDB and so on. But for us, let's take a look at the cookies. If we go to cookies, in our case, we don't send any information about the cookies, but if we send, so here we have the name of that. If we go to any website, and if you check that in the application, what kind of cookies it sends to you, so you can see that you can see there the name of that cookie, value, and domain path, when it expires, and so on.